The harbour at Norfolk, Virginia, received an unusual cargo that early June day in 1943. After 14 days crossing the Atlantic, a vessel carrying 2,500 captured soldiers from the Afrika Korps finally reached American soil. These men, exhausted from their ocean journey, gripped the ship's railings and prepared themselves for what they imagined would come next. They anticipated being met with hostility, expected chains around their wrists, braced for the spittle and curses of an angry population. What their eyes witnessed instead left them momentarily paralyzed with confusion. The docks bustled with activity that seemed bizarrely normal. Workers of different races moved cargo side by side without apparent tension. Women operated heavy machinery with the confidence of experienced professionals. Somewhere in the distance, a brass ensemble performed upbeat melodies. The aroma of fresh coffee and fried dough wafted through the harbour air. Everything these Germans had been told about America, every piece of propaganda they had absorbed, began to crack in that first moment of contact. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of diesel fuel and ocean salt. Mooring lines groaned against the strain of securing the massive ship. Boot heels struck the pier in rhythmic succession as the prisoners descended, each step bringing them deeper into a reality that contradicted their expectations. They had steeled themselves for violence, perhaps even execution. Instead, they walked into a scene of mundane orderliness. Dock workers called out instructions to one another. Cranes pivoted overhead, moving containers filled with grain. Young boys hawked newspapers to passers-by. From somewhere nearby, a radio broadcast a baseball game, the announcer's voice cutting through the general din of the busy port. The contradiction struck immediately. These were men who had spent years being indoctrinated with a particular vision of America as weak, morally corrupt, and racially fractured. Yet before even an hour had elapsed since their arrival, they observed black and white labourers working together without apparent conflict, women handling complex industrial equipment with practiced skill, and sailors behaving as though no global conflict raged across multiple continents. Years later, one of these prisoners would recall thinking that the United States was supposed to be in complete disarray, yet everything operated with clockwork precision. The naval base itself presented a scale that overwhelmed the senses. More than 4,300 acres stretched before them, filled with piers, warehouses, and dry docks that dwarfed anything most of these men had encountered in their homeland. The cranes alone exceeded in size anything they had seen in Hamburg, a port that their own propaganda had celebrated as the pinnacle of German engineering and efficiency. Documentation from that period shows Norfolk handled in excess of 30 million tons of cargo during 1943, a figure that tripled Hamburg's most productive pre-war year. The message communicated itself without words. American strength did not reside solely in its weapons, but in an industrial machine that hummed along at full capacity despite the demands of global warfare. Even the behavior of their guards seemed peculiar. These American soldiers carried rifles, certainly, but many held them casually slung over shoulders rather than at the ready. The prisoners were not bound with handcuffs or chains. No one forced them into humiliating formations. Instead, they were herded with a certain dignity, moved along like weary livestock, but treated as human beings worthy of basic respect. One captured officer would later express his astonishment that the Americans permitted them to observe freely, to see the port operations, the trains, the factories. The enemy showed no fear of them seeing these things. Sensory contrasts burned themselves into memory with particular intensity. The metallic bite of salt air mixed with the sweet smell of fried pastries from a vendor's cart. The sharp clang of steel plates being moved blended with the easy laughter of sailors reading comic strips in their morning newspapers. The baseball announcer's voice continued its steady narration over the radio waves, describing the Yankees' lead in the third inning. For men raised on the speeches and pageantry of the Reich's leadership, this casual soundtrack to wartime industry created a surreal atmosphere. Many prisoners later admitted to experiencing profound internal conflict. The propaganda machine back home had painted a picture of America as economically devastated, plagued by mass unemployment, and incapable of achieving any kind of national unity. Yet the evidence before their eyes told a completely different story. They saw prosperity, boundless energy, and an abundance that seemed almost careless in its generosity. One German sergeant, in a note he somehow managed to smuggle out, wrote that if this was how Americans lived during wartime, he could scarcely imagine what their peacetime existence must be like. This arrival at Norfolk represented more than a simple transfer of prisoners from ship to shore. It marked the beginning of a psychological assault more devastating than any aerial bombardment or artillery barrage. These men had not yet been processed into camps, had not tasted American military rations, had not witnessed the full extent of the country's agricultural and industrial reach. But first impressions carried tremendous weight. The unexpected normalcy of American life, the complete absence of the chaos and weakness they had been promised, began immediately to erode their image of a crumbling, ineffective enemy. Norfolk served merely as the doorway. What waited beyond would intensify these contradictions until they became impossible to deny. Just beyond the piers, passenger trains stood waiting in the Virginia sunshine. Not freight cars or cattle wagons, but actual passenger coaches with real seats and windows. The prisoners blinked in disbelief. In Europe, transporting military prisoners meant cramped wooden wagons that reeked of unwashed bodies and animal fodder. Here, cushioned benches awaited them. A guard gestured toward the open doors with an almost casual air. One prisoner remembered being told to sit wherever he pleased. The paradox grew sharper with every mile the train travelled westward. Rather than routing them through back roads and remote areas, the train took them straight through populated towns and across farmland. Through the open windows, German prisoners glimpsed the private lives of ordinary Americans unfolding in full colour. Men pushed lawnmowers across green yards. Children licked ice cream cones on street corners. Young couples strolled arm in arm along sidewalks. At Richmond's Union Station, civilians waiting on the platforms looked back at them with curiosity rather than hatred. Some even raised their hands in tentative greeting. One German corporal later described feeling as though he had become invisible, as though the Americans simply did not consider them important enough to hate. No one shouted insults, no one cursed. The prisoners might as well have been ordinary travellers for all the attention they received. The abundance visible from the train windows staggered them. Factories belched smoke, but showed none of the signs of scarcity and desperation they had expected to see. Automobile dealerships displayed rows of new trucks. The train route took them so close to the Glen L. Martin aircraft plant near Baltimore that prisoners could actually count the partially assembled bombers on the factory floor. In a single week, Martin's workforce produced more than 30 B-26 Marauders, a number that equaled a full month's output from Germany's Heinkel facilities. The Americans were not hiding this from them. Years later, prisoners would express disbelief that their captors actively wanted them to witness American industrial capacity. Small details impressed themselves on memory with particular force. In station dining rooms, American passengers consumed hamburgers piled high with onions and fresh tomatoes, meals that appeared impossibly lavish to men accustomed to black bread and watery soup. At one stop, a prisoner watched a porter bite into an apple and then casually discard the half-eaten fruit into a waste bin. Decades later, this witness confessed that he could not comprehend such waste, that the sight had tortured and enlightened him simultaneously. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting into the passenger cars provided both torment and revelation. Numbers gave substance to these impressions. By 1943, the United States rail network moved more than 2.5 million passengers every single day, while simultaneously transporting freight tonnage that exceeded Germany's entire capacity. American coal production reached 600 million tons annually, double what the Reich could manage. For German soldiers who had been taught that their nation represented the pinnacle of industrial achievement, these statistics were not abstract figures. They were visible realities, present in every water tower, every rail siding stacked with grain, every whistle blast from a freight train hauling steel to factories. The journey also delivered a psychological lesson of unexpected potency. These prisoners were not hidden from the American public. The government evidently felt no fear that civilians might panic at the sight of captured enemies in their midst. Instead, ordinary Americans were permitted to witness, to observe, to make their own comparisons. Many responded with curiosity, even compassion. Newspapers from the period carried brief reports of German prisoners glimpsed at various stations, often noting their youth, their neat uniforms despite the circumstances, their evident exhaustion. Some American families actually pressed sandwiches through train windows, offering food to men who had recently been trying to kill Allied soldiers. For the prisoners, this openness proved deeply unsettling. One diary fragment expressed it plainly. In Germany, captured enemies would never be permitted to see our cities, never allowed near our civilian population. Here they put us on display. It was simultaneously humiliating and strange, but it created doubt. Doubt, of course, spread like a contagion. If America possessed such confidence that it feared nothing from showing itself, perhaps its strength exceeded anything the Reich's propaganda had acknowledged. The trains eventually reached their destinations, and captivity would begin in earnest with something as fundamental and revolutionary as medical care. When the trains finally delivered their passengers to designated prisoner-of-war facilities, many Germans braced themselves for the worst treatment imaginable. Their mental image of captivity included straw scattered across stone floors, thin soup ladled once a day, diseases left untreated. In German-run camps, Allied prisoners had learned to expect exactly such conditions. Yet the moment these German soldiers entered American compounds, they encountered a reality that shook them to their core. Doctors stood ready. Nurses had prepared facilities. Medicine that seemed closer to miraculous than militarily necessary awaited them. One of the first observations concerned the Red Cross parcels stacked neatly in storerooms. Some packages bore stamps in Hebrew lettering indicating kosher contents. Other parcels contained items that simply did not exist on German ration tables anymore. Chocolate, tinned meat, cigarettes. For Muslim prisoners captured in North Africa, the Americans had arranged halal dietary options. A Swiss inspector touring Camp Hearn in Texas during 1943 wrote in his official report that medical care provided there equaled and, in certain cases, exceeded the treatment received by American soldiers themselves. Statistical evidence confirmed these observations. By 1944, United States military medical facilities had produced more than 20 billion units of penicillin. Germany, hampered by limited fermentation capacity and resource shortages, had managed to produce only a few hundred kilograms of crude antibiotic compounds. To a captured soldier who had watched comrades die from infected wounds in North Africa, witnessing an American medic inject penicillin into a fellow prisoner represented not merely surprise, but a complete inversion of civilization as he understood it. Years later, prisoners recalled thinking that Americans used this medicine on enemies as though they were their own soldiers, something they could never have imagined. The paradox deepened inside the camp hospitals. German physicians who had been captured were frequently permitted to continue practicing medicine under American supervision. Working alongside American doctors, they treated their own countrymen, exchanging medical knowledge in the process. This represented an unspoken gesture of respect. The enemy remained an enemy certainly, but professional courtesy still mattered. One doctor later wrote about his surprise at the collegial atmosphere, noting that no one mocked German medical training, that American physicians asked questions and shared techniques as though they were colleagues in white coats rather than victor and vanquished. Sensory impressions reinforced these messages at every turn. The sharp antiseptic sting of carbolic acid, the steady mechanical hum of electric fans in recovery wards, the crisp texture of clean cotton sheets. These were luxuries absent from most field hospitals throughout Europe. To prisoners of war, it felt like stepping overnight from a medieval infirmary into a modern clinic. Numbers added weight to these visceral impressions. Official United States reports document that during 1943 alone, more than 16,000 German prisoners were admitted to military hospitals, with survival rates exceeding 95%. In Germany's own medical system, survival following compound fractures or pneumonia rarely exceeded 70%. The contrast proved stark enough to silence even the most ardent believers in German superiority. Then there was the matter of food. Always the food. In camp mess halls, prisoners discovered menus posted in their own language. Daily rations averaged 3,400 calories, compared to the meagre 1,500 available at many German military installations. Eggs appeared regularly. Potatoes, beef, and coffee were served as though they were commonplace rather than luxuries. At Camp Herne, the Christmas menu for 1943 listed roast turkey with dressing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, buttered peas, pumpkin pie, and even cigars for after the meal. One prisoner wrote that it was a feast beyond anything their families back home could imagine. This was not sentimental charity on America's part. It represented deliberate policy, rooted in Geneva Convention requirements and in Washington's calculation that humane treatment would yield strategic dividends. Still, for men shaped by years of propaganda about Anglo-American cruelty and barbarity, it felt like entering an alternate reality. A former sergeant, interviewed decades later, confirmed that they had fully expected to be starved, but instead they gained weight. The contradiction proved impossible to ignore. They were prisoners, certainly, but they were healthier, cleaner, and better fed than they had been while wearing their uniforms in service. America seemed to have chosen to fight tyranny not merely with bullets and bombs, but with abundance itself. Yet abundance represented only one dimension of the shock awaiting them. When prisoners moved beyond the hospital wards and into the regular rhythm of camp life, they discovered another paradox entirely. One written not in medicine or rations, but in the freedom to observe America from the windows of their guarded trains. The rumble of steel wheels on rails carried the prisoners deeper into the American interior. Guards sat casually on benches, rifles resting across their knees, while men who mere months earlier had worn the insignia of Rommel's Afrika Korps stared through open windows at a landscape that contradicted everything their education had taught them. Instead of military secrecy and blackout curtains, America seemed to lay itself completely bare before their eyes. Trains rattled past sprawling industrial facilities with gates standing wide open, smokestacks pumping columns of black and white exhaust into the sky. Near Baltimore, the Glen L. Martin plant rose like some cathedral constructed of steel and glass. Inside, visible even from the passing rail line, rows upon rows of B-26 Marauder bombers stretched wingtip to wingtip. Prisoners counted dozens of aircraft at various stages of assembly. One later expressed his amazement. They did not hide their production capacity from us. They wanted us to see exactly how many machines they could build. The numbers substantiated what their eyes witnessed. During 1943 alone, the Martin facility produced nearly 1,200 bombers. By comparison, Germany's Heinkel factory, constantly harassed by Allied bombing raids and crippling material shortages, struggled to deliver even a fraction of that output. America's openness functioned as its own variety of psychological warfare. Not camouflage and deception, but naked confidence. Stations along the route sharpened the paradox further. At Richmond's Union Station, the Germans glimpsed civilian families embracing soldiers on leave, vendors selling sandwiches and newspapers, porters shouting train schedules. No one rushed to hide the prisoners from public view. A few civilians stared with open curiosity. Some smiled. A few even waved. For men who had assumed they would be universally hated, the absence of hatred proved profoundly disarming. Then came the smaller, sharper details that cut deeper than grand industrial displays. Through a cafeteria window, prisoners observed passengers eating hamburgers stacked high with lettuce and sliced tomato. The rich scent of frying onions drifted into the passenger cars. At one station stop, a porter bit into a bright red apple and then casually tossed the half-eaten fruit into a trash receptacle. A German corporal would recall decades later that he had not witnessed such casual waste since before the war began, and in that single moment he understood that these people possessed more than they could possibly consume. Statistics of abundance matched the sensory overload assaulting them from every direction. American farms harvested nearly 3.2 billion bushels of corn during 1943, while Germany, strangled by naval blockades and chronic shortages, managed to produce less than half that amount across all grain types combined. The United States rail system transported 2.5 million passengers daily, while simultaneously moving unprecedented tonnage of coal, steel, and foodstuffs. To the Germans watching from those train windows, the endless procession of freight cars carrying grain, oil, manufactured goods, and military vehicles seemed to have no limit whatsoever. The soundscape told its own compelling story. The mournful whistle of locomotives echoing across river valleys, the steady rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on rails, bursts of laughter from civilians waiting on station platforms. Even the electric hum of neon signs above station diners seemed like proof of an economy completely untouched by want or scarcity. For the prisoners, this visibility felt almost unbearable to witness. In Germany, prisoners of war were hidden from view, their transport disguised, their exposure to civilian life tightly controlled. Here, the Americans seemed to flaunt their prosperity without shame or fear. One diary entry recorded the feeling as humiliation mixed with awe. We saw their people, their machines, their food, their freedom, and they were not afraid to show us any of it. The openness served a calculated purpose. Officials in Washington understood that visible abundance could erode enemy ideology more effectively than any lecture or propaganda pamphlet. This was a demonstration of strength accomplished without firing a single shot. For many German prisoners, it planted the first genuine seeds of doubt about everything they had been told. If their leaders had lied about American weakness and degeneracy, what other lies had they swallowed without question? But the trains served merely as conduits to something even more shocking. The prisoner of war camps themselves represented the next stage of revelation. There, the fundamental paradox would deepen beyond anything they could have anticipated. Instead of cruelty and deprivation, the Germans discovered amenities, wages, and even holiday celebrations that rivaled conditions most soldiers fighting on the front lines could only dream about. When the gates of Camp Hearn in Texas swung open to receive them, German prisoners entered what seemed like an impossible world for captured enemies. Sprawling across 720 acres, with orderly rows of white-painted barracks, carefully maintained streets, and even a dedicated hospital wing, the camp resembled less a military prison than a small American town transplanted into the Texas countryside. The Army Corps of Engineers had constructed it in December of 1942, designing the facility to accommodate 4,800 men, a population larger than the town of Hearn itself. The first paradox struck with immediate force. Every barrack building had electricity. Ceiling fans stirred the humid Texas air, while electric bulbs glowed at the simple flick of a switch. Many German prisoners had grown up in rural villages where electricity remained scarce or non-existent. Now, as captured enemies, they lived in structures fully wired to the power grid. One prisoner later admitted that he thought it must be some kind of trick, questioning how the enemy could possibly provide better living conditions than some homes back in Germany enjoyed. The camp hospital reinforced this initial shock with surgical precision. Equipped with modern surgical instruments, stocked with penicillin and other antibiotics, staffed by both American military doctors and captured German physicians, it became a space where enemies healed together. During 1943 alone, more than 1,200 prisoners passed through its wards, with survival rates matching or exceeding those of American servicemen. The antiseptic smell of carbolic solution, the texture of clean bedsheets, the buzz of fluorescent lighting, All of it impressed upon the prisoners that this represented no ordinary form of captivity. Food became a source of daily revelation and confusion. Men accustomed to subsisting on turnip soup and black bread suddenly found themselves consuming 3,400 calories every day. Breakfasts featured eggs and bacon. Dinners included beef stew and potatoes. Even coffee with actual sugar appeared regularly, luxuries unimaginable back in the Reich. At Christmas in 1943, Camp Herne staged a feast that seemed pulled directly from a dream. Roast turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, cigars for afterward. One officer remembered thinking it was not propaganda or deception. They ate until they could barely move. Prisoners of war feasted like royalty while their families back home slowly starved. Money even flowed within the camp, though in the form of printed scrip rather than actual currency. Each prisoner received 80 cents per day, the identical base pay given to an American private, to spend at the camp canteen. Shelves stocked with cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and even musical instruments like harmonicas offered choices they had never expected to possess as captives. The jingle of coins was replaced by the rustle of paper chits, but the sensation remained fundamentally the same, a degree of autonomy within captivity that defied all expectations. The sensory details proved unforgettable to those who experienced them. The sharp crack of a baseball bat echoed from the recreation field where prisoners played America's national pastime. The smell of roasted peanuts drifted from the canteen. The texture of fresh uniforms, laundered weekly, felt almost decadent compared to the lice-infested tunics they had worn in North Africa. One prisoner wrote that it was captivity, certainly, but it felt as though another country had decided to adopt them. Numbers underscored the full scale of this experience. By 1945, more than 400 major prisoner-of-war camps dotted the continental United States, holding a combined total of 125,000 German prisoners. At Camp Herne alone, over 3,000 volunteered for labour assignments at nearby farms and lumber mills, while hundreds more enrolled in educational classes organised and administered by the camp itself. The scale was genuinely staggering. Captivity managed not as punishment, but as an industrial-scale exercise in practical logistics. Perhaps the most shocking moment of all came not from rations or wages, but from ritual observance of cultural traditions. On Christmas Eve, local American families donated decorations, and camp administrators permitted the erection of a massive pine tree in the central mess hall. American guards sang carols alongside their German captives. One soldier confessed years later that he cried openly because the enemy celebrated their holiest night with them while their own Führer had given them nothing except endless war. This represented the deepest paradox of all. The enemy, rather than attempting to break them through deprivation and cruelty, treated them with fundamental human decency. It planted doubts that no amount of ideological indoctrination could successfully erase. If America's prisoners received better care than Germany's own citizens, what did that fundamental fact say about the world they had fought to defend? But life inside the camps represented only one dimension of the complete story. Beyond the perimeter fences, new surprises awaited. The opportunity to work for wages, to earn money, and to witness firsthand the absolutely staggering scale of American agriculture and industrial production. When German prisoners first volunteered for labour duty beyond the barbed wire perimeter, they steeled themselves for humiliation and degradation. They anticipated shackles around their ankles, snarling guards treating them like animals, hostile farmers eager to exact revenge. Instead, they found themselves transported in trucks to vast agricultural fields of cotton, wheat, and corn, landscapes so enormous they seemed to stretch beyond any conceivable horizon. The paradox registered immediately. Men who had once marched beneath Rommel's command across North African deserts now stooped to harvest peanuts in Texas dirt or pick oranges in Florida groves. Yet they were not degraded or humiliated in the process. They were compensated with actual wages. The numbers astonished them from the very beginning. By 1944, nearly 200,000 German prisoners of war were laboring outside the camps, filling critical gaps in the agricultural workforce left by American men now serving overseas in military units. In Texas alone, more than 20,000 prisoners helped salvage the cotton harvest, ensuring that 3 million bales reached wartime factories desperate for raw materials. In Iowa, prisoners picked corn by the literal ton. In Georgia, they contributed to gathering 50% of the state's entire peanut crop. What began as simple manual labor quickly evolved into an education about abundance on a scale they had never imagined possible. The sensory experience differed dramatically from anything they had known during the war years. Under the relentless southern sun, the sweet smell of fresh-cut hay mixed with the sharp tang of diesel fuel from tractors, machines far larger and more numerous than anything they had witnessed back home. The calloused feel of cotton bolls in their hands and the rough scrape of peanut vines across their forearms reminded them of agricultural work, but the sheer scale of mechanization stunned them into silence. One prisoner wrote later that they realized America could feed not merely its own population, but potentially the entire world if it wished to do so. Farmers, initially suspicious and wary of these foreign workers, gradually grew accustomed to their unlikely labourers. Some greeted them with cold stares and minimal interaction. Others displayed quiet hospitality that surprised everyone involved. Many brought watermelons into the fields on hot days, offered sandwiches during lunch breaks, or provided jars of sweet iced tea. These were offerings of basic humanity extended to men who had been mortal enemies mere weeks earlier. A Texas farmer's wife recalled decades later that the German prisoners were unfailingly polite, worked hard without complaint, and sometimes she forgot entirely that they were prisoners at all. The paradox deepened with the relative freedom they experienced. After completing each day's labour, guards often permitted prisoners to ride in the open beds of trucks passing through small American towns. They observed schoolchildren laughing as they rode bicycles. Neon signs flickered outside diners advertising hamburgers and milkshakes. Families shopped in stores whose shelves groaned under the weight of available goods. For men from a Germany of strict ration books and bombed-out shops, it felt like peering through a window into another world entirely, one operating under completely different rules. Even their wages, though modest by American standards, fundamentally reshaped their daily existence. Paid in camp scrip, they could purchase chocolate, tobacco, or even English language books from the canteen. Some prisoners used their earnings to send Red Cross parcels back to Europe. In a profound twist of irony, men captured in war could now feed their families at home more reliably than some soldiers still fighting actively on the front lines. The statistics paint a staggering picture of this phenomenon. By the war's conclusion, German prisoners had contributed more than 90 million man-days of labour across the United States. They harvested crops, felled timber, constructed roads, and worked in paper mills and manufacturing facilities. Productivity soared wherever they were deployed. The United States had transformed prisoners into a functional workforce not through brutal coercion, but through structured contracts offering fair compensation. Yet the most profound lessons emerged not from measurements of calories or wage calculations. They arose from direct human encounters that neither side had anticipated. One farmer's daughter recalled how a particular prisoner, fluent in English, helped her solve algebra homework problems after working the fields all day. Another family remembered prisoners playing violins at a barn dance, their music drifting into the warm night air as American and German families listened together in unexpected harmony. These moments left prisoners deeply unsettled because they contradicted everything they had been taught. America was supposed to be soulless, materialistic, and fundamentally cruel. Instead, they discovered kindness in strangers, generosity in enemies. For the men who laboured in the fields and orchards and forests, each passing day eroded the propaganda architecture they had believed without question. The Reich had promised a 1,000-year empire built on strength and will. Here, in the open plains of Texas and the orchards of California and the farmlands of Iowa, they witnessed a society that fed both its captives and its citizens with apparent ease. the steady clang of tractor engines, the innocent laughter of farm children playing, the smell of fresh bread baking in rural kitchens. These became the memories that endured longer and cut deeper than any memory of battle's clamour. But beyond the fields and workshops, yet another transformation awaited them. Education, artistic expression, and unexpected cultural exchanges began to unfold behind the fences, changes that would shape not merely the prisoners' evolving view of America, but their own fundamental sense of identity and possibility. Behind the wire perimeter, life inside the camps evolved beyond mere survival. It became simultaneously a classroom, a stage, and an artist's studio. What had begun as captivity transformed into a peculiar form of freedom, constrained yet expansive. German prisoners, stripped of their military uniforms and roles, were given the intellectual tools to rebuild their minds from the ground up. Camp commanders, advised by Geneva Convention requirements and eager to counter totalitarian ideology, actively encouraged educational pursuits. By 1944, dozens of camps hosted what became known informally as prisoner of war universities. At Camp Herne, German officers organized comprehensive courses in mathematics, engineering, English language, and philosophy. American textbooks were supplied without charge. Chalk squeaked across hastily erected blackboards. Evenings hummed with spirited debates about ideas rather than tactics. More than 25,000 prisoners across the United States participated in such educational programs, with some earning academic certificates later recognized by German universities after the war ended. One prisoner admitted years later that they enjoyed more dedicated time for study while in captivity than they had ever possessed at home, that for them it functioned as a genuine university located behind barbed wire. Music and theatrical performance thrived with unexpected vigour. Using scrap lumber, cardboard scraps, and whatever paint they could acquire, prisoners constructed functional stages inside mess halls. They performed Beethoven and Mozart, but also comedies and even Shakespeare translated into German. Violins sang, makeshift pianos rang out, voices rose in harmonic arrangements that would have been impressive in any concert hall. Guards and occasionally local townspeople came to watch these performances, marvelling at the sophisticated skill of men they had previously viewed solely as enemies. The sensory contrast struck observers powerfully. In Europe, Allied bombs were reducing opera houses to rubble, while in Texas, prisoners were rebuilding high culture from wooden planks and determination. Artistic expression flourished as another revelation of human resilience. Prisoners sketched portraits of their guards, carved intricate wooden figurines, painted landscapes depicting the very land that confined them. Some created elaborate murals on barrack walls, transforming bare spaces into galleries. The smell of turpentine mixed with the dust carried on Texas winds, creating improvised workshops that felt more like art schools than military prisons. A Red Cross observer noted in an official report that the creative output of German prisoners astonished everyone involved, that they had somehow managed to transmute boredom into genuine beauty. Perhaps the most profoundly disarming paradox involved how Americans tolerated and even actively respected their captives' cultural and religious traditions. On Sundays, German chaplains conducted Lutheran or Catholic services without interference. Hymns floated into the warm air, sometimes echoing against the guard towers where young American soldiers stood listening in respectful silence. At Christmas, camp administrations allowed tree decorations, nativity plays, and full choral concerts. For many prisoners, this marked the first time they truly comprehended that their captors were not the godless barbarians propaganda had described, but rather people who valued faith and tradition as deeply as they themselves did. Every page turned in those makeshift classrooms. Every musical note played, every brushstroke applied to canvas worked to erode the totalitarian worldview that had shaped these men's understanding of reality. Propaganda had painted America as a cultural wasteland dominated by greed and meaningless violence. Yet here, prisoners discovered Shakespeare available in translation, jazz records spinning on phonographs provided by camp administrators, American guards humming along unconsciously to German Christmas carols. A private from Bavaria reflected years later that in the Reich, culture had been weaponized for political purposes, deployed as propaganda. In America, culture was simply given to them as a gift, freely and without obvious ulterior motive. The sensory details embedded themselves permanently in memory. The scratch of chalk against slate blackboards, the warm amber glow of oil lanterns during evening study sessions, the sweet sound of violin music echoing across the open spaces of camp yards. These memories carried more psychological weight than any harsh command their officers had ever issued, resonated more deeply than any ideological speech they had been required to attend. Still, nothing influenced the Germans more profoundly than direct personal encounters with ordinary Americans beyond the formal structures of education or culture. Farmers, guards, even children encountered outside the boundaries of textbooks or concert performances would challenge everything they believed they understood about their supposed enemies. The true transformation arrived not through formal lectures or organized concerts, but through the simplest possible human interactions, those moments when barbed wire barriers gave way to actual human contact and connection. For German prisoners, the fundamental paradox cut sharply and deeply. They had been systematically taught to perceive Americans as ruthless enemies, devoid of honor or humanity. Yet across towns and farms throughout the United States, they encountered handshakes instead of blows, home-cooked meals instead of starvation rations, and acts of kindness that defied every prediction. The pattern often began during work details outside the camps. A group of prisoners dispatched to repair damaged fencing in rural Nebraska returned with stories not of hostility but of neighbors who brought them cold lemonade on hot afternoons. In Minnesota, farm women baked fresh pies for young Germans after long days of threshing grain in the fields. One prisoner later confessed that they had fully expected hatred and violence, but instead they tasted homemade apple pie still warm from the oven. The smell of cinnamon, the warmth of American kitchens, the easy laughter of children playing, these details penetrated defenses more effectively than any formal lecture ever could have accomplished. The paradox widened further when prisoners visited American towns under guard supervision. In Texas communities, guards sometimes escorted small groups into local shops where German prisoners marveled at shelves absolutely brimming with consumer goods. Fresh coffee, canned peaches, shoes available in every imaginable size. One German officer whispered to a companion that their people back home possessed nothing remotely comparable to this abundance, questioning how anyone could possibly claim America was poor and morally decadent when the evidence before their eyes told such a radically different story. For men who had come from bombed-out cities like Cologne or Hamburg, the contrast felt almost unbearable to witness. Statistical evidence tells its own compelling story. Across 46 American states, thousands of prisoners left their camps daily for various labor assignments, moving freely among civilian populations. By 1945, more than 90% of German prisoners held in America had experienced some form of direct contact with local communities. More than 30% reported being personally invited to family homes for meals or Sunday religious services. The numbers demonstrated what propaganda could never successfully erase. Ordinary Americans perceived them fundamentally as individual human beings rather than faceless monsters. Diaries and letters sent home revealed the emotional toll these experiences exacted. One soldier from Württemberg described being invited to sit at a farming family's dinner table, where they seated him at the head position traditionally reserved for honoured guests, poured fresh milk for him, served roast beef that seemed impossibly luxurious. He wrote that he thought of his own family suffering from hunger back home and found himself unable to stop tears from flowing. Another prisoner described a Christmas dinner in Kansas where he joined in singing carols with the American family hosting him. The letter recorded his confusion. I sang Silent Night with people who should have been my enemies, and for the first time I genuinely questioned what kind of war this really was. The sensory imprints overwhelmed their previous certainties. the rich taste of sweet corn dripping with butter, the sharp crack of wooden baseball bats striking balls in public parks, the sight of children running barefoot through fields unmarred by bomb craters or tank tracks. These were not images of an enemy nation. These were glimpses of a life genuinely free from the chains and restrictions of dictatorship, and for many it sparked a fundamental internal reckoning they had not anticipated. They had crossed the Atlantic as conquerors, utterly convinced of German cultural and racial superiority. Now, as prisoners stripped of that identity, they witnessed a nation that produced more food than its population could consume, manufactured more automobiles than it strictly needed, and still possessed sufficient resources and generosity to treat its enemies with basic human decency. The Reich's leadership had promised glory achieved through fear and domination. America offered prosperity built on freedom and abundance. The contrast could not have been starker or more psychologically devastating to their worldview. By the time the war finally ground to its conclusion, many prisoners no longer perceived themselves merely as captured soldiers awaiting repatriation. They understood themselves as witnesses to a completely different way of organizing society and human life. Some returned to Germany absolutely determined to rebuild their shattered nation, using America as a model, carrying stories of abundance and fundamental human decency back across the Atlantic to share with devastated communities. Others submitted applications for immigration visas with the hope of returning permanently, believing that their future prospects lay not in the ruins of Europe, but in the land that had fed them as enemies and treated them as human beings worthy of respect. In the final analysis, the paradox achieved completion. These men had crossed the ocean in military defeat and humiliation. They departed not broken or embittered, but genuinely transformed by what they had witnessed and experienced. The final words written by one prisoner captured this truth more effectively than any collection of statistics or official reports ever could. He wrote that America's most devastating weapon was not its bombs or its tanks or its industrial capacity, though those were formidable indeed. America's greatest weapon was its fundamental generosity toward even those who had been its enemies. It conquered us, he concluded, without ever needing to fire a shot in our direction.